Good afternoon, all. It is 4 o'clock. Really lovely to have you join the webinar. As you know, we are rolling out a series of webinars around a number of issues, but actually the first one to kick it off for the year is this Introduction to Institutional Racism. It's the beginning of two that will roll out, one in the summer term as well, and it's a webinar that is being delivered between Radwell Trust and Copleston High School. We're having a few technology difficulties getting Andy Green into the room, so hopefully they're resolved towards the end. He is here as an attendee, but we just need to be figuring out his status as a presenter. I'm not going to give too much of an introduction to Gill, but apart from to sort of just say, you know, she is a professor of education at the University of Roehampton. She has researched and written about racism in education over many, many years. And she has experience of working with teachers, educationists, supporting work to address issues of racism in school and also around policy development and in higher education. We are absolutely delighted to have you with us, Gill, and excited to hear what it is that you have to say. In the column, you'll see you'll be able to post questions, and so at the end of the Gill's lecture, you'll be able to I'll be able to sort of present the questions to Gill, and she'll be able to give some responses. But as I say, we intend to run a second webinar, and so where we're not able to deal with all of the questions that you have, or where you're percolating and have questions after the event, then we would really welcome your feedback so we can pick that up in September. Over to you, Gill. Thank you very much for being with us.
And thank you. Hello, everyone. It's a great pleasure to have this opportunity to talk with you about issues related to racism and education. I'll talk for about 25 minutes, and then, as Angela said, there'll be an opportunity to take questions. I am going to use notes, primarily because it's the easiest way of managing the time. So forgive me if I look away from the screen now and again. As you, I'm sure, know, Britain has been a multi-ethnic, multicultural society for many years. Britain is an island, it's a trading nation, and people have come and gone for hundreds of years. In recent times, probably the most significant impact on the ethnic and cultural diversity of the UK is that of British colonialism. But in terms of how the UK relates to this ethnic and cultural diversity, this can be traced back to the Atlantic slave trade from the 16th century. In addition to that, according to the Black social scientist Cedric Robinson, it can also be traced back to feudalism. The arrival of people from the Caribbean on HMS Windrush in 1948 is often cited as marking modern day ethnic diversity in Britain. And then another significant group of people coming to this country was in the early 1960s, when South Asian heritage people came from East Africa. Following both of these events, and since the late 1950s and 1960s, there have been numerous policies on race equality aimed at addressing Black, Asian and minority ethnic young people's needs, and also discrimination in education. And yet, despite this, the key concerns endure. It is clear from the evidence that BAME children and young people continue to underachieve academically. They continue to be disproportionately excluded from school. And the recent Laming report showed a disproportionate representation of these groups in unemployment and also in prisons. As we've heard a lot of recently, young people, particularly men from Black, British, Caribbean and mixed backgrounds are disproportionately stopped and searched by police, at least 4 times more than white people. And the COVID-19 pandemic, of course, has exposed the vulnerability in terms of poverty and health of BAME people. So why is it that in spite of the multifarious policy initiatives and also our developed understanding of inequalities, that the education system continues to fail BAME children and young people? Now, of course, there are many reasons, but underpinning these reasons is racism and whiteness, what I'm going to call white supremacy, and I'll go on to explain these concepts. But first, first I want to give you the aims of the talk, but what's happened here?
The arrow on the bottom left, Jill.
Oh, thanks, Paula. There we are. Right. So the aims of the talk are to begin to address these questions. What is racism? How does racism manifest itself? How is it experienced in the education system, the school and the classroom? What are the educational implications of this for young people? How can we challenge racism collectively in our schools and organisations and in our classrooms, and also as individuals? As well as exploring individual responsibilities, I want to discuss the structural obstacles to change. So let me go on to explain what is racism. So I've got 4 aspects in answer to that question. So racism is the belief or ideology that races have distinctive characteristics such as colour, physiognomy, and some people argue that differences based on culture can be racist. And these distinctive characteristics are believed to give some superiority over others. Racism is a hierarchised system with a very long history that has become embedded in the fabric of society. Racism is pervasive and it is systemic. Now you'll see I'm using this term race, but I've put it in inverted commas because it is problematic. We know there is no scientific basis to race, but I'm using it. It's become part of the public discourse. It's also still used in social science. But I'm using it because it relates and it resonates with people's experiences of racism. It's not ideal. None of the terms I'm using are ideal, but that's part of our debates, I think, to try and find other language to use. So racism is embedded within the state, and state racism refers to the way that racism can be enshrined in laws, such as immigration legislation, in procedures such as the police stop and search, and in programmes such as those on political extremism, for example, Prevent. Racism is institutionalised. And institutional racism, this term, was recognised and legitimised by the Macpherson report, which reported after the Stephen Lawrence inquiry. And it occurs when a whole organisation's procedures and policies disadvantage BAME people. And racism also refers to discriminatory and abusive behaviour based on such a belief or ideology. In the UK, of course, denying people access to goods and services on the basis of their colour, nationality, ethnicity, religion and so on is illegal and referred to as racial discrimination. But the pervasive nature of racism impacts on people's attitudes and perceptions. And these racist views can lead to bias and microaggressions. They can be conscious and also unconscious, intentional or unintentional. But some argue that even if racist attitudes are unconscious and unintentional, the fact that we have not reflected on the danger of such attitudes leaves us just as culpable. So racism is not static. It changes over time with the political, socio-economic shifts within and across societies. Some argue that we should talk about racisms, since there are different manifestations of racism directed at different groups of people. In Britain, a white-dominated society, whiteness is a key element that underpins racism. Now, what do I mean by whiteness? Whiteness is not about white people per se, but it is about the socially constructed and reinforced power of white identification and interests. Not all people are equally white, in that they do not all have equal power, they don't have equal privilege, and they don't have equal influence. But arguably, all white people have equal interest in safeguarding their relative white privilege, and with that, relative advantage. An understanding of whiteness recognises the power and impact of the normalisation and dominance of whiteness, what I'm calling white supremacy. So whiteness is a system of power, privilege and cultural capital. And whiteness itself is a racial identity, but only insofar as it relates to other so-called racial identities of Black, Asian and so on. So let me go on to explain what I mean by white supremacy. Now, white supremacy is not about the narrow racism of right-wing fascist ideology. It's not about the ideologies of the Ku Klux Klan or the English Defence League. It is much more powerful and extensive than that. It is a view that is taken for granted, and it appears as normal. It's central to our lives and it's wholly pervasive. Its dominance is rarely questioned, or its existence is often just not recognised. Let me say something briefly about the socio-political context that provides the conditions for the existence, the development and the perpetration of racism. So until very recently, and I'm talking about the last few weeks really, the key concerns of previous decades around race and anti-racism had waned into the policy background. The focus has been on sameness, on assimilation, and an emphasis on the so-called British values and community cohesion. But also, over the past 15 years, we have seen a tremendous rise in poverty. And with austerity measures, we've seen significant cuts in education, which everybody here will have experienced at the sharp end, as well as other public and social services. And this context, I'm arguing, impacts on individual attitudes and behaviours, as well as impacting on the structure and organisation of society and its organisations and institutions, and specifically the education system. This environment legitimises negativity towards BAME groups, such as regarding police stop and search, attitudes towards immigration, blaming BAME people for unemployment, housing shortages, and so on. The hostile environment promoted by immigration policy and perhaps attitudes of nationalism within the Brexit debate has created an ethos where racist attitudes and practices are seen as acceptable. And we have seen research over the last few years, surveys that have been done, that have shown that people are not ashamed to admit to being racist. But as I say, racism does shift according to the socio-political context, and these attitudes have also shifted. Within a context of austerity and poverty, though, as in other parts of Europe and the USA, we have seen the rise of the far right. However, as I started by saying, at this historical moment, it is almost like the white majority has stopped in its tracks, prompted by the shocking media images of the murder of George Floyd and the upsurge of the Black Lives Matter movement. And I think this provides us with an opportunity to bring about some change. So let me turn to education and its failure of BAM young people. As I said at the outset, Black Caribbean, certain Black African groups, Pakistani and Bangladeshi heritage children, together with Gypsy, Roma and traveller children, are still significantly underachieving, that is, being failed by the education system compared to their white counterparts. This is both at school and also at higher education level. Now, of course, not all BAME groups underachieve or are failed by the education system. And we know that the achievement statistics for children of Indian heritage and East Asian heritage are very positive. Social class is an important factor here, as is gender in some respects, but research has shown that race is the overriding factor. The reasons for BAM underachievement are varied and complex, but as I've said, institutional, structural and ideological racisms are central to this. And in many cases, there is a lack of recognition of the school, the education system, including higher education, of biases and discriminatory practices which marginalise and render young BAM people invisible. Teachers, schools, policymakers and so on are implicated in a complex web infused with dominant white values and perspectives. Teachers play a highly significant role. They are at the interface between society and the children. Obviously, they're not individually or even collectively solely responsible for this, but they're, and really I'm talking about us because we're all educationists, our role is very important. And all teachers and educational professionals have to take some responsibility for school failure and discriminations and the perpetuation of inequalities. And research has shown that white teachers tend to have lower expectations of BAM children, which impacts on their achievement levels. Given the differences in achievement amongst BAM groups, it does suggest a hierarchy of expectations when all other things are equal. Teachers make differentiations between ethnic groups based on their perceptions, perhaps informed by stereotypes, prejudices, and so on. Negative perceptions and depictions of BAM children and young people abound. Black Caribbean boys in particular are frequently singled out as being troublesome, unruly, difficult and disinterested. And South Asian boys, similar to Black African and Caribbean boys, are seen as threatening and prone to forming gangs in school. They're seen as tribal, and the association that is frequently made between Islam and terrorism is very troubling. And I want to just give you some examples from some of my research that illustrate these points that I'm making. So drawing on some research that I did with Black British Caribbean parents, I want to recount some of their experiences. So the parents identified a pattern of racist experiences in schools for most of their own children. The parents spoke about the need to support the morale of their children, and they feared their personality being changed as a result of the pressures they were under. As one mother, Sarah, said, "I'm a mother with an African male child, and I know there's an onslaught on our male children, so I'm very conscious about his spirit not being broken." The parents also talked about the reality of this fear and the downward spiral of underachievement so many of the children experience. These children, they said, their children, began school positively and they did very well. They tended to do very well in primary school, but on going to secondary school, they were frequently excluded because of perceived stereotypical behavioural issues. And many of the children, the parents said, became disillusioned and demotivated and left school at 16 rather than going on to do A-levels, even where they showed promise to achieve A-levels and possibly go on to university. Now, amongst other negative stereotypes, young Black people are constructed as loud, big, aggressive, and particularly the girls as feisty, even when none of these things is the case. For example, this mother, Mrs. Jordan, indicated that physical appearance was a signifier of her son's putative guilt. In her account, she showed how the label of being a threat and troublesome dogged her son. I'm not going to read all of this because I haven't got time, but let me pick out some of what she said, and I'll leave this up on the screen. He felt that because he grew quite tall as well, he thought that the teachers were saying, stereotypically, saying that he's a young, tall Black man, and they feel intimidated by him, which this experience is the norm for most Black youths. And he just began to hate the school. And she went on and she said, and you know, it builds up in your head. And both of them really, referring to both of her sons, it just made them believe that the school had actually failed them because they weren't getting the support they needed. So teachers seemingly felt threatened and challenged by their own perception of BAME children and boys, African Caribbean boys in particular, and also their perceived cultural symbols. Another parent, Aisha, talked about her son, Kofi, who had braids. He was repeatedly accused of various misdemeanours, including stealing a bike, bringing hashish into school, and threatening a teacher. But none of these accusations were substantiated, and in fact the bike, it turned out, was stolen by a white boy. I haven't got time to go on to talk about some of my most recent research, which was in higher education, but this too was also very disturbing in terms of the accounts by the by the white middle class men who we interviewed, who saw the black students and how they demonized the black students as threatening, lazy and disruptive. And they talked about or implied that these students were inauthentic and really didn't have a right to be at university at all. So I'm going to draw to a close now. So first of all, I'd just like to sum up some of the key points I've made. The discrimination and failure of schools to improve the life chances of BAME young people is, in my view, disgracefully enduring. The changing demographics of schools, of course, adds to the intricacies of the needs and expectations that schools and their teachers have to respond to. The fairly constant policy changes that schools experience with fewer resources, of course, also contribute to the challenge. And the changes to teacher education has meant that there is now less preparation of new teachers and less opportunity for in-service development to engage effectively with racial diversity and to learn how to effectively address racism in the classroom. So finally, just to say, again, I think we're at a historic moment which gives us an opportunity to address racism and make some fundamental changes to the education system, our practice and our attitudes. It gives us an opportunity to reflect on and address white supremacy values and ethos. Racism, obviously, is not a new phenomenon, and nor are attempts to challenge and change it. There have been many initiatives in the past, and I think now we need to learn from these and what we have or have not done in the past, and then move forward positively. I get the feeling and the impression that at this point in time, there is a lot of desire to do this in society, but I don't see this being taken on board by the government. We can and should work through our organisations, our unions, as well as at the level of school, classroom, and also work on ourselves as individuals. If we are horrified by the racist behaviours that we've seen recently via the social and mainstream media, if we're concerned by the failure of the education system of many BAME children, then doing nothing is not an option. Doing nothing is, in effect, colluding with a racist, discriminatory system. The question now, of course, is what should we do? I think there are plans for the future after the holidays to support you with answering this question. But let's now have some questions from you and see how much of a discussion we can have. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Gill. That was enormously interesting for me and I'm sure others to listen to. It will be, it is recorded, just to remind you, so it will be available for you after if you want to go back. But we have got a number of questions that have come in to be able to put to you, if that's okay, Gill. Certainly at the Radwell Trust, and I know Andy Green, who is still struggling to get in, and there's all sorts of things we're learning quickly, aren't we? Around how to share and pool our knowledge and resources, I suppose. But I know that he shares the belief with me and with our two communities that this is a very, very rare opportunity for us to start to address racism and make that fundamental change that has been a long time coming. So I'm going to go to some of the questions in the toolbar. Laura, are you able to publish those. So I've got one coming in from here, which is, if white power or supremacy is systemic in the wider community, what chance do schools have to make change?
Well, it's a good question. As I said, white supremacy, racism is a structural issue. But schools are part of society. Schools are part of that issue. And I mean, personally, I think we as individuals and collectively have to work on all fronts, if you like, at all levels. We aren't just teachers. We have multiple identities and multiple roles. So we can work in those different spheres. But in terms, as we've been brought together today as educationists, there are some very concrete things we can actually do. And certainly school leadership, and Angela is clearly an advocate of this. School leadership is supremely important. I mean, as a young teacher myself, we didn't have that kind of leadership. If you've got your school leaders leading the way in challenging racism, then your job is half done for you. But you know, there are so many things we can do. We can look at what's going on in our own schools. We can look at the achievement levels in our own schools and reflect on those. We can look at the exclusion levels and reflect on those. What's going on here? I don't know, maybe yours are absolutely perfect. Then you can help other schools with that. But I'm sure it's not perfect, because it's not perfect anywhere. And we're all faced with these immense challenges. But also we can look at the curriculum and different curriculum areas. And you can do that on your own, but best of all, you do that in your teams. And there is support. There is support out there. And Angela and Andy will be drawing on other support to help you do that. And then the other aspect, and it's an aspect to address in terms of the issues I've been talking about, but also an area where you can seek support, and that is the parents and the communities that you are serving, if you like, and hopefully working with. And I think parents and community are a great resource here. Hope that begins to answer that question.
No, absolutely, and I couldn't agree more with the idea of, you know, enlisting partners and working together to make improvements and fundamental change. You know, I know the Radwell Trust, and I know this is, you know, there's things that also Copleston are looking at, and their trust. We are commissioning an external audit to be run by Diverse Matters to really get underneath and challenge some of our practices. It is important to take a very deep breath and be part of making that change. I mean, certainly. We have a number of questions actually that have come in, and I'm sort of going to group them a little bit. But one question is, are we too reluctant to speak up for fear of saying the wrong thing? Would you consider that to be a concern or an issue within school communities?
Yeah, I think it is. I think, again, a really good question. And I mean, I know, working with teachers myself and also working with student teachers, there is anxiety about saying the wrong thing. But I don't think we should worry about saying the wrong thing. I mean, clearly we've got to try and create, well, a bit of a cliche this, safe spaces where we can do that. But I think those safe spaces are important. But people have to be ready to be challenged. And, you know, you might use the wrong word, so to speak. But if someone says, well, I don't think that's an acceptable term, then we've got to be ready to take that on board. But equally, the challenger, I mean, I do think there is a right and wrong here. I do think there are lines to be drawn. But what I was going to say, that equally, I think the person who does the challenging has got to be open to discussing and has got to be receptive to having debates and not be dogmatic. I'm not interested in being dogmatic, and I really think we should avoid imposing guilt on people, because I'm saying these things now, I've done this research and so on, but I haven't got all the right answers by any means. I hope I've got the right answers, but maybe I haven't got them.
We often talk about the difference between, at the Radwell Trust, and again, you know, we often talk about the difference between candor and challenge and combat, and there is something around that for me, isn't around that question, that, you know, it's the mutual investment in having challenging, candid conversations that are uncomfortable but are receptive and not combative. That you know, but that's, yeah. And certainly when I frame my own thinking of how we look into our own organisational cultures and our personal cultures and ways of being, it's a helpful mantra for me, maybe. So we're also there's a few questions coming in around curriculum, and I'll sort of group those a little bit, if that's okay. Somebody has come up with a question. The national curriculum appears, or it seems to be, very white. And do you think that BAME culture is not widely celebrated, has an impact on unconscious racism?
Well, what I think is what I was trying to get at about white supremacy, white domination, this all-pervasive whiteness and perspective, the lens through which we all look, because we all live in a white-dominated society. So this affects not just white people, but also Black, Asian and minority ethnic people too. We've all been inculcated with this white perspective. And I'd like to look at, or I'd like to look at the curriculum or whatever I'm doing from that position of trying to challenge, trying to look at things differently, not look at things in the way I've always looked at them. And I know this is a bit nebulous, but it's worth struggling with. So it's about questioning, it's about developing a critical perspective. And I don't mean negative, I mean questioning. That what we do, what we say, what we practice, we need to examine, really. Now, the question about is BAME culture not part of the national curriculum? Well, I suppose I find the term culture really problematic, because what does it mean? You know, whose culture? But I think there is a question here. Whose culture is valued? Whose culture counts? And the national curriculum embodies a very, very narrow culture. It's very white, it's very middle class, it's very narrow. So, but one of the problems, if we talk about BAME culture, what are we talking about, you know? I mean, those people who we are homogenizing under that term, and it's my term, I use that term, and as I said, it's also a problematic term. But those people are not homogenous. Those people in themselves are very, very diverse. And it's often become a shorthand. And they're also, the majority of those people are British born. And by looking at someone, if they've got brown skin, you have no idea about their culture any more than looking at me about my culture. You make assumptions about my culture, and you make assumptions about that Black or Asian person, about their culture. And that, I think, is problematic. And so when we come to address the curriculum, I think we need to shift our starting point. So, I mean, history is, for me, I think history is an easy one, actually. So if you take history, one of the problems with history is we don't teach. I mean, you might in your school, forgive me, but generally we don't teach history very fully. And I actually think in Britain, we need to teach about the history of British colonialism. We need to explain what role Britain played in the world and what contribution that has made to the world that we live in today, globally and nationally. And we need to look at that in all the negative as well as the positive ways. And through that, we will see the history of people who are now British, but have historically come from those other countries, such as India, such as the West Indies, such as parts of Africa, and so on. It's not easy, it's not straightforward. There isn't a straightforward answer to this.
Yeah, no. It's very. There's a few questions that are coming up around role models in school, and so one question in particular: having positive role models in school massively improves the confidence of students in schools. What can be done to employ Black teachers and staff who will likely inspire Black students? What are your thoughts around that?
There is a whole debate about role models, but I'll leave that aside and address this question. I've worked in teacher education. I've worked in a school of education in the university sector for donkey's years. For half of that time, I worked in on teacher education programs, and there aren't very many Black and Asian and minority ethnic students coming onto those courses and staying on those courses if they come on and going into schools. And a colleague of mine recently, about 18 months ago, did a small-scale study interviewing with Black male primary student teachers. And it was a small sample, but a third of those, before she'd finished the research, a third of those male students gave up their course. And one of the reasons they gave up was this reflected the same experiences as those who remained. And it was because of the racism they experienced. And they experience it in the university. I'm not just pointing the finger at schools by any means, but you know, a lot of teacher education now is spent in schools, and they had some terrible experiences. I mean, from the children, but not supported by the staff, but also from the staff. I mean, this is not overt racial abuse, but it's about being marginalised, it's about being undermined. It's about things being made difficult. And I do think that is probably unconscious, which comes back to the need to be reflexive. But, you know, the TDA way back, maybe it was a long time ago, to me it's but they did have, they invested quite a lot of money in campaigning to try and encourage BAME people to apply to do teacher education, to become teachers. Well, we've got a huge teacher shortage, haven't we? Yeah. And I think it is also tied up with the way teachers are treated generally. I think it's still seen as quite a low status profession, although I am hoping in the light of the COVID lockdown, all these parents have suddenly seen what a challenging job you all do. I'm hoping that will change things. So maybe it's that. Also.
Thank you. I'm going to just ask you one question that perhaps it has been raised by somebody, and perhaps it's one to and I'm looking a little bit at the time, but because it's possible to perhaps pick that up and leading into the September webinar. Like I say, we're really hoping at the Radwell Trust and through our partnership with Copleston to be able to roll out a series of webinars forums, discussion groups with Gill and others around these issues through next year. And one of the questions that has been raised is, or one of the pointers really is, can you point us in the direction of some research into how to effectively increase parental engagement for BAME groups? The question poser says that they've attended several webinars that have suggested this is really important, but haven't really suggested how we can go about that and where to sort of look, you know, what research to start to look at to help us frame strategies in that way.
Yeah, I can point you in the direction of strategies for engaging parents and some papers and so on. And so maybe I could send you some of those, Angela.
Yeah, that would be wonderful. Yeah.
And Andy, and then you can distribute them to staff. I mean, in the USA, there's masses of work done on engaging parents, but there is also some work done in this country, and there are also various critiques of parent-school relationships, which I've contributed to myself. But I'll send you some references, and that should at least answer that question a little bit.
Thank you. I could speak to you all night. Actually, I feel like it's you know how passionately we believe in this, both at Radbourne Trust and and at Copleston, to be part of the seminal change that we know that this moment is affording us. And so for attendees, thank you very, very much for your time. The questions that are posted and that haven't been answered or I haven't raised, we will put those to Gill and perhaps ask her to comment and then publish those. On the Radbourne Trust website, we'll keep a recording of this and also details of future webinars, and Copleston will have a similar approach that I'll let Andy describe where that's going to be. But thank you very, very much for your time. Thank you for sharing your work and your insights with us, Gill. And I look forward to seeing the group and more in the September term. Thank you very much.
Yeah, and thank you also.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.